Committee, American Politics with Senator Dianne Feinstein, Sunday at 6:30 and 9:30 Eastern and Pacific, here on C-SPAN. Now, authors and journalists Bill Salmon and Roger Simon discuss their books on the 2000 presidential election. The two also reviewed the morning headlines. The segment from today's Washington Journal is about an hour and a half.
At our table, Roger Simon, Bill Salmon. Here's the books right here on the desk. There are two different books there. You can see Divided We Stand, At Any Cost. Bill Salmon, did you know you're number 11 on the Wall Street Journal list this morning?
I didn't know until you pointed it out. I'm very tickled to see that. Well, I've been surprised that the book has resonated as much as it did. I figured it would resonate with a certain number of people, but the response has been just overwhelming.
And Mr. Simon, your publishing company did a nice job of breaking out all the new information in here, and I'm going to read one.
Okay.
There were only two cabinet meetings in 1998, one in which Clinton lied to his cabinet about Monica Lewinsky, and one in which he repented for lying. Daley, that's Bill Daley, who had gone on TV and defended Clinton after the first one, was the only cabinet member who refused to go to the second one. Afterward, Daley called Clinton's chief of staff and said, "Look, I'm glad I didn't go. I don't quote scripture. I don't cry. I don't hug. What would I have done at this thing?" Question mark. That's new to you?
Yeah, Bill Daley had an interesting role to play in this election. He had been a close friend of Bill Clinton's, golfed alone with Bill Clinton's. He had been Bill Clinton's Commerce Secretary, and now was running the Al Gore campaign and had a deal on a daily, weekly, monthly basis with the fact that Bill Clinton was hurting the Gore campaign and had to try to keep him as much as possible at arm's length, and was continually refusing requests by the White House to put Bill Clinton on the road for Al Gore, which the campaign would be very heavily criticized for after Al Gore lost.
Bill Salmon, Mr. Simon also writes that Bill Daley believes the election between Bush and Gore was so close because, quote, the public never really liked either one of them, unquote.
Well, I suppose there's a certain amount of truth in that. Even Democrats, I've talked to a lot of Democrats who didn't necessarily like Gore personally, but preferred his ideology. And I think there were a lot of people that maybe didn't like Bush. I think it might have been a little bit greater on the Gore side because he'd been around so long, been on the ticket, he'd been in public life, and you know, after a while people tend to pick on you more, whereas Bush was more of a fresh face. I think he might have got a little bit of an easier ride.
Mr. Simon, there's a lot in Mr. Salmon's book I want to ask you about, including this, this paragraph. Journalists would also regale their offspring and anyone else who would listen with the tales of their role as chronicles of this historic episode. Naturally, they would ignore their simultaneous role as Al Gore's chief enablers, having made the whole post-election debacle possible in the first place through their bogus and biased coverage on election night. Journalists spent the next 36 days rationalizing every Gore offensive, no matter how odious.
The Gore campaign didn't view it that way. I think both campaigns always thought that the press was in the tank for the other side, in the tank being a journalistic phrase for being in favor of. You know, I think most journalists were just having a hard time covering the last 36 days. It was a good fight, and good fights usually make good stories, but it was also, and one of the triumphs of Bill's book, that it makes it understandable. It was a very hard story to understand. It was a legal story that kept ping-ponging back and forth in the courts, and most journalists I know were just scrambling to keep their heads above water and figure the thing out on a daily basis.
Now, your book is different. You covered just what period?
I just covered the 36 days.
And your book?
The whole campaign, from '99 through the Clinton pardons after the inauguration.
Mr. Salmon writes this: Gore had barely stepped away from the podium when the media gushing began in earnest. ABC's Peter Jennings actually choked up on the air. So did Chris Matthews, the Democratic host of MSNBC's Hardball. Virtually every journalist in America tripped over himself to praise the address as spectacularly gracious. Nothing short of the speech of Gore's political life, in quotes. In reality, it had been the speech of Gore's political death. It was as if Gore's 7 minutes of magnanimity somehow made up for the previous 36 days of relentless political selfishness. The cad who had tried to disenfranchise GIs serving overseas and civilians living in Seminole and Martin counties was suddenly celebrated as a perfect gentleman. The ruthless politician, I'll turn the page, who had personally directed a smear and destroy campaign against Florida's Secretary of State for daring to uphold the law, was now practically likened to Lincoln at Gettysburg. The Nixon-like figure who had obsessed over his enemies, real and imagined, ranged from the Democratic mayor of Miami-Dade to the Republican rioters, was hastily enshrined on the loftiest pedestal of statesmanship.
Does this book have a point of view? You shouldn't hold back.
I think that the press treated these two combatants on an equal ethical plane throughout the 36 days. I think that was a little too convenient because basically in the early days we heard a lot of this, well, one of these two guys is going to have to step aside for the good of the country. Well, it was said as if the onus was equally on Bush, even though he had won. Bush won every recount, and yet the press portrayed these guys as equally culpable in this protracted struggle. And I think that was a little too convenient, and I think that you can assign some ethical weight to their relative positions in the fight.
How do you deal with the Republican mini riot during the counting in Miami-Dade? Was that the high road for the Bush campaign?
Actually, I have a chapter on that, and I devote quite a bit to it. And the point of it is that really the so-called riot inside the Miami-Dade building there was spontaneous, was not some sort of orchestrated right-wing malevolent black helicopter organization, and it was peaceful. There was some rough stuff outside, but in the building where they actually pounded on the door and said, you know, let us in and start the vote count, nobody got touched.
These Republican workers who work right in that building over our shoulder there for Tom DeLay and others just happened to be in Florida at that moment?
Well,
their plane tickets were paid for by Republican campaign funds. Their hotel rooms were paid for. They were given a huge party in Fort Lauderdale afterwards where Bush and Cheney came out and thanked them and congratulated them.
Yeah. Well, you know, I actually look at that. You know, people were down here to handle the recount, and it was an organized campaign to handle the recount. They had observers, they had lawyers, they had all kinds of people, and they were staying in hotels, and it was organized. But the protest itself was a spontaneous thing that happened on the spot because the Miami-Dade Canvassing Board made a decision, a very surprising decision that day, and they thought they were being cheated. And you know, Republicans are not known as a protesting group of people. Democrats are quite good at this. And so I think that's one of the lasting legacies of this standoff is that Republicans, you saw them starting to learn the hand-to-hand political combat tactics that the Democrats have mastered a long time ago.
We want to go to the phones, and we'll have plenty of time to get everybody's point of view. I want to make this point that you make in your book. Roger Simon writes in his book that at the height of the Florida recount, Gore was worried that riots would break out in black communities in Miami and other Florida cities, so he called leaders and urged them to tone down the volume. Quote, I want to make sure this doesn't get out of control, Gore said. The Gore camp believes the Bush camp was purposefully turning up the volume in order to create chaos. Let's go to the phones. Ann Arbor, Michigan, on the Democratic line. Good morning.
Yes, good morning, Brian. Good morning, gentlemen. You know, I'm really finding this all just unbelievable anymore. We're still going to beat up on, let's drag out Bill Clinton. We already did this morning to trash him for a while more, as Bush can do no wrong. Brian, is this supposed to be a balanced show? It sounds like both these reporters are pretty much trashing Gore. I know the one guy seems to be defending him slightly, but can either one of you reporters come out after, by the way, also this morning it comes out there was no vandalism at the White House, but it was just a little blip. Can any one of you comment on the fact that the Republicans were planning, they thought that Bush would win the electoral vote, or the popular vote, and Gore would win the electoral vote. So they had a huge campaign all planned with talk radio hosts to completely undermine the electoral vote, to, you know, slam them. You know, this has been now going on 9 years of beating up on the Democrats. You know, you talk about, I would like to know where this so-called liberal media is. This is just unbelievable.
Thanks, Roger Simon.
Where are the liberal book buyers? No, I deal with, in the book I do deal with what you say, and there is an element of truth to it. The Gore campaign had been alerted up more than a month before Election Day that Bush thought he might win the popular vote but lose the electoral vote, and they had a plan for wooing electors to change their vote, the so-called faithless voter strategy, which the Gore campaign considered too and then rejected at the end. In the end, there was only one faithless elector from Washington, D.C. who didn't vote for Gore out of protest. it was interesting that the exact opposite result occurred for Bush. He did, in fact, win the electoral vote, but lost the popular vote by more than 500,000 votes.
Let's get some calls in, and we'll keep going back and forth. Fort Smith, Arkansas, Republican line. Good morning.
Hi, I'm nervous. But why pick on each other, and why don't you guys let the government be the people for the people?
What do you mean by that?
You know what the Constitution says. You know what I mean.
No, but what, I don't understand what you're saying. Why you want everybody to just get along?
Why don't you let us make our laws as the Bill of Rights, you know, the House of Representatives? Let us run the government like we're supposed to, because obviously you're not following our forefathers' constitutional rights. And one of these days I will be the first woman president, but I'm not from Arkansas. I'm originally from California.
But go back to, what do you mean? What is the press doing that is not constitutional?
You won. The media is regulated, and you know you lie.
Who won?
I didn't say one. Duh.
That's the way I feel right now myself.
You got done. You got done on international TV.
Whoa. What a morning.
It's going to be one of those mornings.
We're good. Anyway, did you have something you wanted to say after?
No, just obviously it's an important historical episode, and I think it deserves attention. A lot of people are blocking the Florida thing. I mean, we were so immersed in it, and it was a painful, wrenching period in our history. And I think only now, 6 months out, are people really able to sort of be willing to plunge back into some of these books and relive the emotions of that time. And I've heard from people that say, God, it's like going through the thing all over again. But now that you have a little distance, I think some people can do it.
Did you enjoy writing this book as much as you did Showtime or Roadshow, the other two books from the other two campaigns that you wrote about?
It was much different because we were all on accelerated schedules. Obviously, for campaign books to come out this quickly after the last campaign was over meant we had to sit in basements or attics or studies and bang the things out. But it was fun. What's most fun is going back and talking to people after the election and hear the truth for the first time. During the election, a lot of people don't want to give you the truth.
On the record in your book, what part of it is on the record, who talked to you the most? I mean, who behind the scenes or somebody, is it Bill Daley that talked to you?
Yeah, Bill Daley was a continuing character from beginning to end in the book. Probably I interviewed him the most.
And in your book, did you have...
Well, I was able to get on-the-record interviews with President Bush and Vice President Cheney. When I covered the Gore campaign for 18 months and 2 years, I had, at various times, conversations with the Vice President. But once Florida locked up, he chose, and in fact since then, he chose not to grant interviews, not only for this book, I don't think for any book on the record, on the political book.
Here's just one of the quotes. I was serene, Bush told the author, meaning Bill Salmon. I was never dark. My mood was never dark because I felt like I had given it my all. We had run the best race we could conceivably have run. Where did you get that interview? Physically, where did you do it?
Well, I was actually on the road with the president in March, and we were, he was flying around selling his tax cut package. It was a 5-day trip, and he made some time for me in his hotel suite, and I was able to sit down and talk to him.
Dayton, Ohio, for Bill Salmon and Roger Simon. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. A Republican book buyer here who's on her way to buy both of these books. I'm so excited that that was on my agenda today. And I just wanted to make the comment that it's so frustrating for me that whenever the truth is told, it is called, I'm going to make reference to the angry Democratic caller, it is not bashing, it's called telling the truth, giving the facts. And as long as an author is writing, and this is not innuendo and allegations, then I say thank you for exposing it. Thank you for telling the truth. And, excuse me, I'm a little nervous. There's so little of it out. Just finally, after this last election, finally a little of the truth, if you are a conservative, is starting to seep in.
Thanks. New York City, you're next. Good morning. You're on with Bill Salmon and Roger Simon. Hello, New York City.
You're still with me.
I'm apologize. I don't know what, we got the wrong line here. That's my fault. New York City. Duh. That's the headline of the morning.
I've written the same exact book.
Who?
Mr. Salmon.
We missed your first part.
Oh, I'm sorry.
We missed everything until I just hit the button right again.
Okay.
Start again.
My question is for Mr. Salmon, and I wonder if the Supreme Court had chosen Mr. Gore, would he have written the exact same book?
Do you think he would have?
No.
Why?
Well, I think that this is another attempt to smear the Democrats.
Thanks. Mr. Salmon.
Well, I think if Bush had done what Gore had done, I would have written a book that said how Bush did steal the election. And let me be specific. If Bush had waged an orchestrated campaign to disqualify military ballots, for example, or if he had encouraged his aides to smear Katherine Harris, or done some of these other things that I thought were ungentlemanly, then I think that I would have done a book that said that Bush stole it. But Bush didn't do those things. Gore did.
Mr. Simon, some more things that you wrote in your book. Half the Gore staff thought the subliminal rats advertising story was so stupid that the New York Times would laugh them out of the town. Instead, the Times ran it on front page.
The rats episode is one of the great cases of probably the best planting of a story by a political campaign in recent history. The rats ad was a Republican ad which the Gore campaign analyzed frame by frame. And during one brief matter of seconds, the word rats of Democrats flashes on the screen. And maybe people remember the subliminal advertising scare of 30 or 40 or 50 years ago when the FCC banned it, that movie theaters were going to put, you know, a Coke on the screen, and you'd go out in the lobby and buy Coke or something like that. No one ever, I think most people didn't really believe that the Republicans had planted a subliminal rats in their commercial. But Chris Lehane of the Gore campaign put together a tape. He put together material. He took it to the New York Times. The New York Times reviewed it. The New York Times called experts. And the New York Times ran it on page 1. And it threw the Bush campaign off track for at least 48 hours.
Bill Salmon?
I'd like to just say that 2 weeks before that New York Times article on the front page, I was on Fox News Channel, and Tony Snow showed that tape the day that ad was released. And he froze the frame, you know, in front of hundreds of thousands of viewers that said, stop the frame, it says rats. And we laughed about it and joked about it and talked about whether PETA had been alerted, you know, dragging rats into a political campaign. And we laughed it off for what it was, sort of it looked to me like a silly coincidence, because they were using the word Democrats and they were zooming in and out on the word in different parts of it, and that happened to be one part that they zoomed in on. And then for 2 weeks later, the New York Times to do this breathless front page story as if they had just learned, and to suggest that Chris Lehane had to analyze the tape. The tape was on TV analyzed as such.
The Gore people were confident that Fox News would not make too much of the fact that it had been on, because it showed how little impact the story it had was on Fox News, and they were right in that. Some people did know, and in fact in later editions the New York Times put in that it had been on Fox News first, but I think the Gore campaign cleverly assessed that they weren't going to get whacked too hard with that.
Whatever happened to Chris Lehane?
Chris Lehane has started his own consulting firm here in Washington, D.C.
St. Louis, you're next.
I wanted to ask Mr. Simon if he had anything in his book about the voter suppression that happened in Florida. And I wanted to ask Mr. Salmon, how could you win an election if the black vote was suppressed?
Can you tell us what you think happened in Florida?
I think what I think happened in Florida.
Yeah, I mean, how do you know that voters were suppressed?
Well, I watched the civil rights hearing, so that's how I know voters were suppressed.
Civil Rights Commission.
There were, yeah, but there were things happening here in St. Louis because my sister went to vote, because I'm not a voter. She went to vote, and she said that they were asking her for additional ID, which I know from the commission is illegal.
Why aren't you a voter, by the way?
Exactly what happened in the last election and my religious beliefs.
Thank you.
This is not a small issue. It's an issue that's going to resonate in 2004 if George Bush wants to win Florida. A lot of black people in Florida believe that they were kept away from the polls by design, on purpose, by a Republican governor and by state police and other police. There are tales of police parking their cars in front of polling places, of black voters being disenfranchised by being asked for 3 forms of identification, and on and on and on. And whether each and every case is true or not, the impression exists in the minds of, I think, a great many black voters in Florida that the Republican Party did not want them to vote. This is something that President Bush is going to have to break through and do something about if he is going to get above the really low 8 to 9% figure that he got of the black vote in 2000.
Bill Salmon?
I completely disagree. I watched those Civil Rights Commission's hearings very carefully. We sent a reporter down there to cover it. We looked for specific evidence of even a single person, black or white, who had been forbidden and barred from casting a vote, and we didn't find it. And all we saw was really, and I'm being absolutely objective here, was a lot of innuendo. I went through and looked at the news articles after this came out, and I'm looking for the actual news in the articles, and it was, well, you know, stories, and even if they're not all true, just the perception and the stories that maybe somebody, if there was a person that was blocked from the polls, that person's name would be a household name right now. We'd all know about that person's story. The reason that there isn't a household name is because that person doesn't exist.
But don't you agree that perception is a real problem?
Perception is a real problem in the sense that the media keeps repeating this innuendo that somehow, you know, the Bush brothers blocked blacks from voting in Florida. The black turnout in Florida was at record high levels, so I don't know how blacks were barred from voting in Florida. The real suppression of votes in Florida came when the networks called the state before the polls were closed. And in the Western Panhandle, there were 500,000 voters that still had time to vote, and that cost George Bush a net loss of 10,000 votes.
How do you know that?
Well, there were 3 surveys that showed that, one by a Republican polling firm, one by Yale Law School, and one by Bob Beckel, the Democratic strategist who tried to flip electors. So they all agreed this cost Bush 10,000 net votes. Now, the reason that's important is because the election came down to only a few hundred votes. It was the very closeness of the election that made it so tantalizing for Gore to hang in there and try to cobble together 51 votes in this county and 27 votes in that county to just get ahead of Bush. If he had had 10,000 votes to overcome, he might not have hung in there for 36 days.
But 10 to 15,000 is the number of votes that studies also say Al Gore lost on the butterfly ballot alone.
Well, the butterfly ballot's another issue, and I think that was highly overblown and misrepresented as well in the press.
Hemet, California, Republican line. Good morning.
Good morning. Finally got through after all these years.
Welcome.
Yeah, I was just wondering, because in California, Gore won by over 1 million votes. So if Bush would have won 49 states and Gore would have won California, does that mean that he would win presidency of the United States? Secondly, throughout the whole campaign, they were saying that Houston was the top smog capital of the world. Now California has 4 of the top counties, and Houston's dropped to 5th. And I just don't understand the difference between Gore and Bush.
Roger Simon.
That's not the way the Electoral College works. Gore actually took California by about 1.3 million votes. But in the Electoral College, you get electors based on the number of people that you send to Congress. So one for each senator and one for each Congress person. Gore won the popular vote nationwide by 540,520 votes, which is 5 times more than John Kennedy won by, which was a significant number of votes, but he lost in the Electoral College because he lost Florida.
Lake Worth, Florida, Democratic line. Good morning.
Good morning, C-SPAN. I have a question about how Katherine Harris enforced the laws that I've never really seen addressed. And it concerns the Florida statutes, and it is the law concerning the automatic recounts. And that law, according to that law, our automatic recount should be nothing more than a clerical check. The law says that you are to examine the tabulation of ballots, compare it to the returns, and if there's a discrepancy, then you go with the tabulation. And there were at least 20 counties that did have recounts. There were at least 20 counties that never had any kind of recount. And I just wondered why Harris allowed this. And
Bill Salmon.
Well, she actually raises a good point. There's a myth that the first recount, the mandatory statewide recount, was somehow done with this uniform standard. But in reality, she's right. Some counties didn't even actually recount. All they did was check their tally sheets to make sure there was no discrepancy. Others recounted by machine, and still others used hand examinations in that first period. So it just goes to show that the recounts were employing different standards even from the beginning, even in the mandatory recount that was mandated by the state.
In your book, you quote from the Washington Post columnist and style section writer, is it Javon? Is that the way she pronounced her name?
I don't know if it's that or Givens. I'm not sure.
Her first name is Robin. This is from back, you may remember this, back in the middle of the campaign, talking about Katherine Harris. Her lips were overdrawn with berry red lipstick, the creamy sort that smears all over a coffee cup and leaves smudges on shirt collars. Her skin had been plastered and powdered to the texture of pre-war walls in need of a skim coat. And her eyes, rimmed in liner and frosted with blue shadow, bore the telltale homogeneous spikes of false eyelashes. Caterpillars seemed to rise and fall with every bat of her eyelid. Her mouth is set in a jagged edge. One of the reasons Harris is so easy to mock is because she is, to be honest, seems to have applied her makeup with a trowel. At this moment, that so desperately needs diplomacy, understatement, and calm, one wonders how this Republican woman who can't even use restraint when she's wielding a mascara wand will manage to use it and make sound legal decisions in this game of partisan one-upmanship.
I think that was probably not the Washington Post account, but the demonizing of Katherine Harris was unfair and unfortunate, and had come off 8 years of a White House operation who demonized people as second nature. That's not to say that Katherine Harris didn't at every major opportunity, in fact minor opportunities, rule in favor of George Bush. She did, and the Democrats thought she was being partisan and unfair, and they wanted to strike back. But I don't think there's anything very honorable about either what the demonizing of her or some of the coverage in the press. It's the inevitable result of celebrity politics.
This same reporter said Harris looks harsh, she looks bad. We'll ask Bill Salmon about this in a moment. Let's go to Charleston, South Carolina, and Republican line. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, gentlemen. I have one thought about why it's possible that Al Gore may have lost Florida, and I've been trying to express my opinion since the election fiasco happened. What about with Elian Gonzalez down there? Isn't it possible that they could have lost a lot of minority votes as a result of them shipping him home, maybe not giving him a fair chance that the folks down there thought he deserved?
Bill Salmon?
I think Gore had the worst of both worlds on that, because on the one hand, she's right, the Clinton-Gore administration did ship him home, which angered people in the Cuban-American community. On the other hand, Gore sort of flip-flopped, trying to take a contrarian stance and break with the administration on this, but then he backpedaled from that flip-flop and was really all over the map, and as a result, his stance came off as something of a muddle and sort of pandering, and so he really lost ground on that issue.
Roger Simon, you write in your book that relations between the Bush White House and John McCain are so bad that McCain staffers get 3 or 4 calls a week from reporters who say top Bush aide Karl Rove is telling them that McCain is terminally ill.
It is a venomous, poisonous atmosphere still to this day.
Still doing this?
Between the McCain people certainly believe it to be so. They also say that John McCain is in good health and he has survived his skin cancer. But from South Carolina on, there was no love lost between the Bush forces and the McCain forces, and the mere fact that Bush became president has not changed anything.
Do you have any proof that Karl Rove is telling them that McCain is terminally ill?
None whatsoever. That's their belief.
Let's go to Woodbridge, Virginia. Good morning.
Good morning. I just want to make a couple of points, and then I get off and listen. First, the 2000 election has not been forgotten, nor has the point of how the election was won. Has anyone addressed the fact of DBT database erasing 22,000 valid voters, and you call Bush has won the election?
Where did they do this?
They did it by with the means of Katherine Harris and Jeb Bush. It's in Florida, in Miami. I watched the testimonies on C-SPAN when Mary Frances Berry chaired the Civil Rights Commission, and certain people had to come before and testify due to irregularities in the voting. And DBT Technologies in Miami, purging supposedly the felon database, purged over 22,000 valid voters. Then the voters come to vote, their name is not on the register.
Thanks.
I think it's wrong to, obviously, to purge people, legitimate voters, from the voting rolls. And obviously it's unfortunate if that indeed happened. It's also worth noting that a lot of people were allowed to vote who shouldn't have been allowed to vote in Florida. Illegal felons who were barred by law from voting. Miami Herald did a survey of about a dozen counties showing that thousands of felons cast ballots and 75% of them voted for Gore. So Gore picked up a net gain of several thousand votes that are on the books right now because you can't go back and take them off. There's no way to trace them. And you know, again, we're talking about an election that came down a few hundred votes. He had several thousand illegal votes from felons in his favor.
Tacoma Park, Maryland. Good morning.
Yeah, this is directed toward Bill Salmon, and you know sometimes it's hard for me to remain a Republican because of folks like him. Now you said you did you went down there and you did research, okay? And you said as far as voter suppression, there's allusions to that. Now you just said that the lady said that there was some purging of legal voters, and you said, well, if that happened, well, if you research this. The election results in Florida, I would have assumed that you would have looked into that and you would have some kind of definitive answer to give. I would have assumed that you would have looked at the totality of what went on down there. Let me tell you something. I just can't wait till we get the kind of Republicans that are not anti-Democrats. And you say Gore stole the election. If Bush was trailing by 500 votes, are you telling me that the Republicans would not have done the same kind of thing?
Well, I think the Republicans would have put up a vigorous fight, and they would have pushed for obviously they would have supported the mandatory statewide recount because they wouldn't have had any choice. And they might have even gone for selective hand recounts. And those are, of course, they were found unconstitutional in the end, but at the time they were legal. But I think it's entirely open to argument whether Bush would have tried to throw out military ballots to gain the presidency, whether he would have smeared top elections officials in Florida, whether he would have retained a electoral college expert to advise him on the possibility of flipping faithless electors. So, I mean, there's degrees to this and how far you're going to fight and when it becomes unfair.
Roger Simon, do you agree with Mr. Salmon, who says that Al Gore, went after this whole situation vigorously, vituperatively at the last 37 days?
Oh, that his campaign did? They went at it vigorously.
But he personally led the charge.
No, I don't think he led the charge personally. And I think about the question that the caller asked was an interesting one. What would George Bush have done if he had trailed by 537 votes? And my answer is a little different than Bill's. I think what the Bush campaign did in South Carolina shows that it would have done anything. I talk about not smearing someone. The smear campaign launched in South Carolina against John McCain, where he was accused of the most vile and untruthful things, showed that in politics, George Bush was, like most politicians, willing to do anything to win.
But you think that Al Gore actually engineered that 37-day strategy?
Well, I don't think he set out to have it unfold exactly as it did, but he was clearly, by all accounts, almost micromanaging it, making decisions large and small from his dining room in his residence at the Naval Observatory, whereas Bush, I interviewed him about this. I said, you seemed almost detached down in your ranch. He said, yeah, I turned it over to Jim Baker. I talked to him every day, but he delegated it, and Gore didn't delegate. Now, obviously, there were people around him that were true believers. Joe Lieberman was very much determined to keep fighting, but Gore made the decisions to keep going, and he directed this campaign.
I have a question for you. This is one of those rare questions where I don't actually know the answer. It's a real question. You wrote earlier that Bush was serene at the end, and I think most people noticed that when they saw his public statements. Do you think in part he was serene during those 36 days because if he had lost, he still would have been fine with it? He would have gone off to his ranch and gone fishing?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It wasn't the end of the world for Bush to lose that election. But as we know, and in fact we read in the back cover of the book, that, and it's been widely quoted, Gore himself said, if Bush loses, life goes on, but if I lose, I'll do anything to win. And this was widely quoted. And of course, earlier on, some years ago, he said, when you run for president, you're going to rip the lungs out of your opponent. So he's a very ruthless political campaigner. And I think it's been very devastating for him to lose. I don't think it would have been as bad for Bush.
Bill Salmon is originally from Cleveland. Roger Simon is originally from Chicago. And Mr. Salmon was educated at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, and our guest, Roger Simon, at the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana. We go next to West Bend, Indiana, on the Democratic line. Good morning.
Good morning. It's West Bend, Wisconsin.
My apologies. Go ahead.
That's fine. I had just two comments, one on truth and one on hypocrisy. The earlier caller, the Republican caller, said she was finally glad or whatever to see the truth coming out as she saw the truth. Well, the truth is the truth with a capital T, no matter whether you're Republican or Democrat. Secondly, the hypocrisy angle. All of the managers in the House pushing the impeachment of President Clinton all those months, turns out were the biggest hypocrites in the world. Newt with his babe on the side in his office, and all of them being basically exposed.
Who do you trust today, then?
Pardon me?
Who do you trust today, then? Who do you like in this town? What of all these politicians you see in here, who you say that's my person?
As opposed to, well...
As opposed to, that's not my person.
One thing, distrust is something else. All of the people that, not all, some of them are good people, some aren't. The people that came in '94, the vast majority of them that I could see were ideologues. And I don't think we need those from either party.
Name somebody in this town today that you think is great.
I like Lieberman. I think he's honest, straightforward, religious, everything that the religious right, quote unquote, should like.
Thanks. Honest, straightforward, religious?
Well, I point out in my book that Lieberman was less than honest when it came to talking about this campaign to disqualify military ballots. As we all remember, there was a 5-page memo written by Mark Herron, one of the Gore lawyers, detailing how to disqualify military ballots. And when it was revealed, Drudge posted it on his website, and the press wrote about it, it became a public relations disaster for several days for the Gore campaign. They put Lieberman on the Sunday morning talk shows to do damage control. The night before, he was prepped by none other than Mark Herron in a phone call where Mark went over with Senator Lieberman what to say and what the talking points were. And yet, when Lieberman got on with Tim Russert and others that morning, he acted like he didn't know anything about Mark Herron, didn't know anything about this memo, and pretended like this was all news to him, and that, in fact, as far as he was concerned, his staff had just said that, you know, we're supposed to follow the rules just like the Bush campaign. They had the same instructions. Actually, the Bush campaign's instructions were to count every military ballot, even if they were Gore ballots. I found cases where Bush lawyers fought to get Gore ballots counted, because in some counties they actually write D or R on the outside of the envelope. So Bush lawyers objected because they had orders to object to every military ballot, and lost. And the Gore lawyers objected. The Bush lawyers prevailed in getting Gore votes counted.
You say in your book, Roger Simon, up until the very moment its decision was handed down, Gore believed that the U.S. Supreme Court would rule 5-4 in his favor, with Sandra Day O'Connor coming over to his side. How do you know?
He couldn't believe, he told associates who were there at his elbow for all those days in that dining room and other places in the Vice President's mansion. He couldn't believe, one, that the Supreme Court would intervene in a state election and thwart what he thought was the clear will of the people. I mean, don't forget, at the time that the Supreme Court intervened, the count had not been completed, a count ordered by the state Supreme Court of Florida. They put an end to the count, and this is what Gore believed would never happen.
Philadelphia, you're next. Go ahead, please.
How's it going?
Good.
Oh, man, I can't believe I'm on TV.
Welcome.
Well, the first thing I want to say is this election, to be forced to swallow this what happened, you know, for the sake of civility, I think about how the rest of the world look at us, and it's, oh man, it's sad. It really is.
Why does it matter what the rest of the world thinks of us?
Well, we all have to live together. You look at how our relations, how we just got kicked out of that civil rights panel. It's a joke.
Laurel, Maryland, on the Democratic line. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you. Actually, what I wanted to say is that both of these people they've been following this whole thing that happened this past election year. I think a recurring theme throughout whoever ended up winning, and in this case it was Bush, we need to definitely reevaluate and update our election process on local level, because there was so much of a fiasco that no matter who looks at it, there is some discrepancy, and there are some people that were disenfranchised, and there were problems everywhere throughout the country. And it has to be addressed.
Thanks. Thomasville, North Carolina, you're next.
All right, thank you.
You're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Okay, my name is Gary Welch. I like your show, by the way. My question is, if you go back to the subliminal message about the rats and Democrats, people say that that's illegal or whatever. You know, are you familiar with that there is absolutely no laws on subliminal messaging?
Mr. Simon, what do you think?
In fact, the FCC forbids subliminal messaging.
Mr. Salmon?
I wasn't aware of that, but again, I don't think this was a subliminal message.
Garland, Texas. Go ahead, please.
Hi, I can't believe I got through. It's been months and months and months. I disagree with a lot of what Mr. Salmon is saying. However, I'm not going to get into arguing all of that because I think it's an exercise in futility. But there's one point that has been bugging me ever since all this started. The mindset of people who stay away from the polls because, well, the election's already been called. I never could understand that. I live in Texas. Every year I go to the polls and I vote I'm a Democrat, okay? I know in the presidential election, my vote, as far as my candidate, winning the state of Texas, forget it. But your vote isn't just a popularity contest to pick out a popular man. Your vote is to show whether the man who is selected has a mandate to carry out his views. And the only way that shows is by how many votes he either won by or your candidate lost by or whatever. So, as I said, I just think that people who use that as an excuse to stay away from the polls just don't feel like taking the effort it takes to get there because it's a lame excuse. And
let me ask the two of you. Thank you, callers, for all those points of view. But let me ask you about the current situation in Al Gore. What, in your opinion, will he do next? Will he run again in 2004, Roger Simon?
Yeah, I think he will. I think he sits there wherever he sits and thinks about the fact that he got 500,000 more votes than his opponent and that he lost a state by 537 votes. And he's probably telling himself after the pain subsides, hey, I didn't run that bad a campaign. Maybe I'll win in 2004.
I think the Wall Street Journal reports this morning he's got a party coming up in his house for some of his campaign aides and then another for his supporters at the city brewery or whatever. What do you think?
I disagree. I think he may try to run. I don't think he'll even get the nomination of the Democratic Party. Here's a guy who had peace and prosperity, the power of incumbency, the wind at his back, couldn't take out George W. Bush, who was portrayed as a lightweight. Gore has been on the presidential ballot, the ticket, since, what, 1988? We're now going to be going on 20 years where you will see Gore's name either as president or vice president. And I think a lot of the Democrats that deferred to him last time, because it was sort of his turn, will show no such deference this time around. He is going to be vigorously challenged by other Democrats, and I think the Democrats feel that it's time for a fresh face on the ticket, whether it's, Senator Bayh or Edwards or someone that isn't even on the scene yet. I can't imagine that Gore will be the nominee.
Friendswood, Texas, for our two guests who have books out, Roger Simon and Bill Salmon, you're on the air.
Yes, good morning. The comment I had, a lot is always made of the fact that Al Gore won the popular vote, and I've always questioned the legitimacy of that claim strictly based on the fact that, had it been an election based on the popular vote, the strategies of the campaigns would have been so much different, than they were. For example, Al Gore would have campaigned in Texas, and you'd probably have voters in those states that went hard for one candidate or the other who, didn't come out to vote strictly because, the fact that they knew the states were already locked up. I'd just like to hear a comment, on what they think about the significance of the popular vote.
Roger Simon.
Well, that is the Bush party line. That's how he explains the 500,000 loss, that he never really wanted to win the popular vote. The strategy, well, not that he never wanted to win it, that the strategy wasn't to win the popular vote. The strategy was to win to win the electoral vote. Unfortunately, you can't find any examples of them saying that till after Election Day. The fact is, no one went into this election thinking it was going to go to the Electoral College. That just doesn't happen in modern American political life. It didn't happen until the year 2000. Whoever won the popular vote won the Electoral College. Both campaigns went out to get as many votes as possible, in my opinion.
Mr. Salmon.
I hate to keep beating up on the press, but I believe the networks cost Bush the popular vote. Not only did they call Florida prematurely, but they, within less than an hour after calling Florida, they called Pennsylvania and Michigan. And we were all told the trifecta was tantamount to winning the White House for weeks and weeks and weeks. They called the last of these three states at 8:48 p.m. Eastern Time. That's 5:48 on the West Coast, where millions of Californians are getting off of work, getting in their cars, heading to the polls, and they're essentially told, you know, Gore won Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Florida. It's all but over. I think there was a precipitous drop-off in voter turnout among Republicans. Easily, Bush would have picked up more than 500,000 votes and won the popular vote. Now, obviously, the Electoral College is what decides the presidency, not the popular vote. But Gore was able to wield this as a political weapon for those 36 days and buy himself some running room and say, look, I won more votes than the other guy. I ought to be able to file some of these lawsuits.
Kwaizi Mfume, head of the NAACP, will be with us in 45 minutes for 45 minutes. Let's go to Brandon, Mississippi on the Republican line. Good morning.
Good morning. The one thing that nobody talks about is that Florida wouldn't have meant anything to either candidate if Gore had won Tennessee. He couldn't even win his home state, where people knew him best. And if he'd won Tennessee, then nobody would have had to worry about Florida.
What do you think, Mr. Simon?
That's true, and I deal with it in the book. If he had won Tennessee, or if he had won West Virginia, or if he had won Bill Clinton's home state of Arkansas, he had trouble in all three states. He had troubles because he underestimated the power of the NRA, the gun lobby, who was putting up TV ads that were really battering him. He didn't spend enough time in his home state. West Virginia, though nominally a Democratic state, they knew that Bill Gore was not, that Al Gore, sorry, was not friendly to the coal industry, that he was a strong environmentalist. And you can go on and on through it. The fact is, it's all hindsight. If you had told Al Gore a week out that those three states would have made a difference, he would have spent more time there.
We're looking at the new Wall Street Journal bestseller list, and I asked both of you what it means that Mick Foley, I think he used to be referred to affectionately as Mankind when he was a wrestler, has a new book on there. He's number 5, and we go down the list. Tom Brokaw's number 10, and then Bill Salmon's number 11. And of all the books on the election, correct me if I'm wrong, yours is the only one that's hit the bestseller list?
Actually, I don't know about that. I think there was another book that made the New York Times bestseller list. If I'm not mistaken, Roger Wood.
Deadlock.
Deadlock made it to 15, I believe.
The Washington Post book.
Yes.
Yeah. Does this say anything about anything? I mean, Bill Salmon's got a point of view in this book.
I think it's good news that political books make the bestseller list. I want to point out my book's only been for sale for 2 days, and if everyone watching would just buy 7 books, we could get. But no, it's a great triumph for Bill to get to that list and to get to the New York Times list. I'm very happy when political books make the bestseller list. I'm probably less happy when wrestling books do. But you know, it's amazing. Books are expensive. That people will go out and put down 20, 25, 30 bucks for a book is a great testimony to the fact that this country is not falling apart.
When was your last word written for this book?
The last word was written probably February 4th or 5th.
And Bill Salmon?
February 28th, the deadline for turning it in.
And yours is how many pages?
Pardon me.
How many pages is your book?
350, 360.
Mr. Salmon?
It's 294.
And how much is your book, Mr. Simon?
$25.
And Mr. Salmon?
I think mine's $27.95, but
there you go. It's a bargain.
What's a couple of
Butler, Pennsylvania, Democratic line. Good morning.
Yes, I would like to comment on Mr. Simon's views here. I saw Mr. Simon at least 2 Gore rallies in the Pittsburgh area. One I remember especially was at the Rachel Carlson Center. I saw Mr. Salmons get off the bus, come over.
Salmon or Simon? Which one did you say?
Salmons.
Washington Times, Bill Salmon. Go ahead.
Well, yes. And instead of interviewing, we waited around for 2 hours after his speech. And when Vice President Gore got out of the car to come over and talk and shake hands. Salmons, all he did was complain about having to get off the bus and miss the bus. I don't think he has a lot of respect for Mr. Gore from what he showed at that particular rally. The idea that I went also to rallies for Bush, and Bush would not even let people in his rally, even fellow Republicans they would not let in the rally. So that to say that Bush would not do anything to win is absolutely absurd. Now, Mr. Salmons has never commented on the fact that we waited around 2 hours after that rally to meet Gore, and all he did was complain when he did do it.
Gore, let me ask you this. You seem to know a lot, and why would you be watching Mr. Salmon at a rally, and why would you be going to...
He was right there, right behind Gore. I heard him complaining to another reporter there. Whether or not he admits to it or not, it's the truth.
And what party do you belong to?
I'm a Democrat. Why would I be waiting for Gore if I weren't?
Well, you said you went to the Bush rally also.
Yes, I went to protest.
Okay. Oh, good. Mr. Salmon, you want to defend yourself?
I assume what he's saying is true. It's a time-honored tradition for campaign reporters to complain about getting on and off the bus to other reporters. I mean, that's what we do.
Is that only something that somebody who didn't like Al Gore would do at the rally?
I missed the gist of the complaint. Was he complaining about what you said or the fact that he couldn't get to see Al Gore?
I think he said I was complaining about getting on and off the bus, which I probably was.
Reporters complain all the time. It's what we do.
Why?
Because we're whiny. No, I mean, we have great jobs, and we have, compared to a lot of people, coal miners, waitresses, other people, easy jobs. However, during the campaign, we're working virtually the same hours as the candidate. In the case of George Bush, probably more hours than the candidate. They're long days, we're on and off the bus a lot, and we tend to complain. We probably shouldn't.
Fall River, Massachusetts, independent line. Good morning for Bill Salmon and Roger. Yeah, good morning.
Yeah, I'm a Ralph Nader guy, and
yeah,
I was.
What happened?
I'm very disappointed in him where he's been on this environmental stuff. But my opinion is, well, that Salmon guy that's sitting there to the right of you.
Yeah.
I think he has zero credibility with anything because he's so one-sided. Basically, the people who are buying his books are just people who want to read what he writes, which are the Republicans. And that's it. I don't think any independent or any Democrat or anybody of any ilk that's not Republican would even consider this guy as being anything but a right-wing nut.
Why?
Well, because he never says anything good about anything that's not Republican. I mean, anybody who's just so one-sided one way has no credibility. I mean, there's got to be a balance when you're discussing things. There's got to be, well, Gore did this right, but Bush did this wrong, or Bush did this right and Gore did that wrong. With him, Bush does everything right, Gore does everything wrong, so there's no balance, there's no credibility. What I got to say is this. In Florida, I got family down there who are Native people. They're going to be Gore people, and I'm going to tell you why next time. Because everybody likes a heavyweight fight, right? And when a decision comes down that's very, very controversial, they want a rematch. And that's why I think Al Gore is going to come out. And I think all these people who were for, like I was, for Nader, because we were left of Gore, is going to come out and vote for Gore next time. We want Gore to run. We want Gore to come out because we want the rematch. Now, this one was a Don King fight where it was a fix. We want a rematch, and we want it to happen in 2004. And I think it's going to happen. And I think Gore's playing it right because what Gore's doing is just laying low. And it's only going to count in 2004. So he's going to start picking up the momentum in 2002, 2003. Whatever he says now is going to be forgotten in 2004.
Who put the fix in your opinion?
Oh, the Supreme Court, of course it was. Hey.
Well, but if you're right though, what would you do if you were in the Senate right now? As if somebody retires from the court, would you let somebody be appointed and nominated and then confirmed?
Let me tell you something. I think the whole thing is out of our control. I think like a lady had called earlier and said, the law of the land is the Supreme Court. And that's sad because it should be 8-0 decisions. Now there are a lot of 5-4 decisions coming down. And the bottom line is they did decide the election. They stopped a recount, which in Texas would have been totally legal and totally done. George Bush signed in a law stating there should be a recount when that's that close. You got a state, and you got 500 votes separating people. You don't want a mandatory recount? I mean, come on. And then the Supreme Court stops the vote. And then I saw all that commission, that Civil Rights Commission with that Berry, and I was watching that, and I was horrified by some of the stories.
Thanks. What do you think, Bill Salmon and Roger Simon? Defend yourself.
Well, first of all, the book is not an ideological book. The book doesn't say Al Gore is bad because he favors abortion or high taxes or whatever. The book is about political tactics. It doesn't get into whether the guy's, positions on social or economic issues are good or bad. And again, if Bush had done some of these political tactics, I think I'd have been just as critical. The book has a lot of criticism of Republicans in it. And, anybody who knows my career knows that I cut my teeth in Cleveland exposing voter fraud, mostly against Republicans, getting Republicans thrown out of office. So it doesn't matter to me whether it's a Democrat or Republican. If somebody's going to do some underhanded tactics and it's a good story, I'm going to be all over it.
Do you know any other reporters that would have written a book like yours, though?
Oh, sure. I mean, I think there are other reporters who would write this book. I know the title really kind of is become controversial, the word steal, but I think that the word is backed up. I mean, I think that he was trying to take something by unjust means, and therefore it's justified.
Roger Simon, what do you think of Bill Salmon's analysis?
I think the best way to punish Bill Salmon would be to buy my book. Bill's book is obviously one with a point of view, but Bill is known in this industry as being a fair reporter.
Does yours have a point of view?
Mine has a point of view, but I'd like to think that it's fair. There's a lot of criticism of Bush. There's a lot of criticism of Gore. The caller's other point, though, about Ralph Nader is an interesting one. Ralph Nader got 97,000 votes in Florida, and the Gore campaign always believed they would have gotten at least some of those votes, at least more than 537 of those votes, and that Nader cost them Florida.
How many decisions at the White House today, Bill Salmon or Roger Simon, do you think are being made with an eye toward 2004?
Oh, all of them.
They're taking polls and looking at what...
You bet.
Really?
Oh, yeah. They took polls all during the campaign. They always do bounce out and say, we don't care about polls. They polled from day 0 to through the 36 days.
Do you agree, Mr. Salmon?
I agree completely. I don't think they're as focused on sort of day-to-day polling as, say, the Clintons were. But I do think every decision is weighed against 2004. They've got a long-term, what they call strategery group. Dana Milbank from the Post had a wonderful article about this, about the strategery group, which looks at not just 24-hour cycles or a week, but looks months and years down the road.
So decisions on energy and the upcoming decision on military and the decisions on Social Security, all those are going to be with 2004 in mind.
Everything is with 2004 in mind. That doesn't mean you do something that you can't ideologically or honestly back, but there's all nuances in this game. This first year is one, first 117 days, is one when Bush is pushed pretty far to the right. I'll bet you as the congressional elections of 2002 get closer, he'll move back toward the center.
Miami, Florida, Republican line for Bill Salmon and Roger Simon.
Hi, I'm calling from Miami, and I voted this last election, and when I went to the poll, I didn't have my voter registration, and I was asked for ID. I knew where my precinct was, and I knew what the rules to vote were, so I took my ID. And I was just wondering why in the newspaper we read about everybody being disenfranchised, people being blocked from voting, but there's no mention of that. There's no voter education. Voters just assume they can show up at any poll with no ID and vote.
Thanks.
Well, I think there have been a lot of newspaper articles about this, especially recently. There's been some sweeping reforms instituted in Florida, and a lot of that money is going to be going towards voter education. I think one of the things that came out of this standoff in Florida is that voting is a very messy and imprecise sort of sausage-making operation. I think a lot of people had their eyes opened up to, they thought that it was this hallowed, sacred right, and their vote was very sacrosanct. It really isn't, and I think it's good that we're getting some reforms now to clean up the system.
Our guest will be with us until 15 minutes past the hour, which is another 30 minutes, and I want to go back to the points that Mr. Simon makes in his book, like. New York Congressman Charlie Rangel says he may have encouraged Hillary Clinton to run for the Senate from New York, not because there was no qualified native New Yorker to run, but because she could raise a lot of money than they might have.
Yeah, Charlie Rangel is one of these wonderful people who rails against money in politics while raising it hand over fist, like about every other politician in America. And one chapter of the book deals with a fundraiser that Al Gore and Hillary Clinton and Dick Gephardt and other Democrats attend, which raises $4 million at a nightclub in New York, and just the nuts and bolts way that you get money out of people in politics today.
Watertown, Massachusetts, Democratic line. Good morning. Watertown, Massachusetts, are you there? Hello.
Yes. My name is Sharon, and I want to very briefly respond to a question that the host made. Is Brian correct?
That's correct.
You asked who cares what the world thinks?
Mm-hmm.
I was living in Europe during the Monica Lewinsky incident, and the papers were constantly condemning and laughing at the United States because they perceived that what Bill Clinton did as a president versus what he did in his private life were two different things. The second question that you made as a host was, who do I trust, or who would someone trust in Washington today? I do not trust anyone. I am a disabled person. I'm 43 years old. I've been involved in politics since I was 15 and voting since I was able to legally vote. I would like to ask both of these gentlemen, why in the world would I go to all the trouble, and it is a great deal of trouble and pain to get me to the polls. Why should I go to vote for anyone anymore when my vote no longer counts? Because this past year, I struggled desperately to get to the poll to vote.
And what happened?
I was able to vote, but although my candidate, Al Gore, did not win the majority of the votes, he is not the president. I was taught as a child in American public schools that my vote counted, and to me, it now appears that it does not.
Why do you say that?
Because the person, and I do somewhat to agree, do understand the Electoral College. I firmly believe if it were my choice, we'd throw it out completely, and it would be a popular vote election. I think that that would be much more clear to the vast majority of Americans who find the entire political system incredibly complicated.
Let me go back to your comments about what people think of this country. Do you think the people in France or Great Britain care what we think of them?
Yes, and they're angry about it.
What do you mean they're angry about it?
They're angry because their perception of Americans, and I have been told this by people literally to my face, this is not hearsay, this is something they have said to me. They are angry because of our supposed arrogance, our supposed belief that we think that we're better than everyone in the world, et cetera, et cetera.
My actual question, though, is just the opposite of that. Do you think people who live in France and are French citizens care what we think about them?
Yes.
You do?
Yes, I do.
Mr. Simon?
I think this is an interesting call, not because of the European part of it, but because of, I was prepared to disagree with the caller violently because I thought she was saying at first that because her guy didn't win, her vote doesn't count and she doesn't think politics works or that. But that's not what she was saying. In the end, she said she thinks she's disillusioned with our political system because of the Electoral College, and I couldn't agree more. It's an 18th century anachronism. We shouldn't have an Electoral College. It should be the will of the people, and it should be a popular vote. And not because Al Gore got more or George Bush got more. It's just that it's not relevant to U.S. life anymore, American life.
Mr. Sam?
Well, I was taken by her point about what other nations think of us and whether they're making fun of us. And I have to say that in the main, I don't think we should be driven by other nations' opinion. I mean, I lived in Europe for several years and I loved it, and I saw the opinions of America, and I don't think we should be necessarily overly influenced by what they think. I think it's just like a human being. You shouldn't worry too much about what people think of you. You should worry about whether you're doing the right thing, and I think that's what this country has done. And, if the French and others want to, make fun of us when we lock up our election like this, I think we could take it.
Sarasota, Florida, good morning.
Good morning. This is a kind of a silly question after all of these very serious comments, but as a nurse, I observed something during one of the debates, and it's driving me crazy. And I wonder if anybody else noticed this. I think it was the time that Al Gore stalked over to George Bush and in a threatening manner, and I thought, well, has this guy got cowboy boots on, or what is this? And I think he had lifts in his shoes, even though he was taller, I think, than Bush anyway. I think this was to make him look threatening. Could this be true, or was I imagining it?
Thank you. You write a lot about the debates.
I think of all the hours I have spent observing Al Gore, I've never seen him in his stocking feet. I'm proud of that, by the way. So I can't tell you if he has lifts in his shoes or not. He's a pretty tall guy, and he is taller than George Bush. The debates are hilarious because we pay attention to things like that. They have really become the most important performance aspect of the campaigns. I wrote down some figures about why the debates are so important, not because anything intelligent or especially revealing is said. It's because 25 million Americans watch these two guys give their acceptance speeches at their conventions. 12 million watch them on Oprah, but about 40 million watched each of the three debates. So it is the big kahuna of the campaign season, of the presidential election. And Americans, as that call shows, care about body language. They care about if Al Gore's size or not. And they care about what the candidates look like.
Can I ask you, though, right in the middle of that, 40 million watched it, but 62 or 3 more millions voted in that. So 63 million people didn't watch the debates.
Right.
So why did it have such a great impact?
Well, because anything that attracts 40 million voters has a huge impact. The other 60 million may have not watched the debates and may have formed their opinions on a different basis, but this is one night where you get to reach a huge percentage of the electorate.
Would you two think a moment about, if you can tell us things that you feel about these two men, George Bush and Al Gore, based on what you know about being around them, covering their campaigns, seeing them on a day-to-day basis, about openness and trust and likability and all that. Let me, did you have something you wanted to say about what Roger Simon just said or anything?
Not really, no.
Okay, let me go grab a call and we'll come back. Cleveland, Ohio, good morning.
Yes, I've got a couple of questions for Bill Salmon. He's been asked twice now, and he conveniently doesn't answer it, about this Texas firm cleansing the voter rolls down in Florida. And the lady asked a good question earlier. You know, he says he went down there and watched all that stuff, and he said if it's true that happened, first of all, why does, if he did go down there and look at all that, why doesn't he know if that happened or not? And secondly, I'd just like to throw in there where he says that all those Republican voters on the Panhandle were disenfranchised because the networks called the election early, or Florida early for Gore. We all know how Republicans vote. I mean, they get out there and vote, if there's one thing you can say about them. And it wasn't just a presidential election. These Republicans had their congressmen, local issues that I'm sure they went out and voted for. A senator, I'm sure they went out there. So to say that they all sat home and didn't vote because of that call, I think is a bogus argument.
Was there, by the way, either a gubernatorial election or a senatorial election in Florida?
Yes, and it was right down to. I opened the book with a guy, and he has an excellent point, with a guy who ended up not voting. He was on the way to the polls, heard the call on the radio, and said, the heck with it, and went home. And I spent a lot of time with this guy, grilling him as to why he wouldn't vote. And it turned out he actually was a very dedicated Republican. He actually had a lot of people he wanted to vote for, right down to the county sheriff, who happened to be an acquaintance and friend of his. But he was so distraught when the call came, because the presidential election is what most people really focus on, of course, in a presidential year, that he just blew it off and went home. And that's not an excuse. I don't think that's right for people to do. But it happens. Most people don't. Most people continue and vote. But statistically, there's a certain number of people who are dissuaded.
Can I ask if you can put on the same plane? I mean, people have talked about those voters who went in and punched two different candidates, and the other side says, well, you're so dumb, you figure it out. What about this situation where if you're listening on the radio and somebody says, so-and-so is going to win, you say, does that make you smart that you turn around and go home?
No, I don't think, again, I don't offer any excuse for the people who did that. I think the right thing to do is to continue to vote, even though your vote won't count for president, because as we know, the electoral votes in a state aren't divided up. It's a winner-take-all proposition. But the reality is that a certain number of people are influenced, and I merely pointed out as a way that the networks did alter the outcome of this thing and kind of set the stage that made it possible for Gore to launch this quest for the presidency.
Mr. Simon? I think you make a good point. You can't have it both ways. You can't say the votes that count in Florida are the votes that were actually recorded and legal and justified, and that gives Florida to Bush. But on the other hand, Bush would have won the popular vote if we take all these imaginary votes that people might have cast but didn't actually get to the polls and cast. Either a vote counts because it was cast and proper and legal, or it doesn't count at all. I think if you're going to use one standard, you ought to apply it to the nation as a whole.
These two books are in your bookstores, at least both gentlemen hope they're in your bookstores. Divided We Stand is the name of Roger Simon's book. At Any Cost, How Al Gore Tried to Steal the Election, by Bill Salmon. And Bill Salmon woke up this morning to find out that the Wall Street Journal has him at a number 11. Do you know, either one of you know of anything on the New York Times or the...
Go ahead, Bill.
Well, mine is supposedly number 5 on the next New York Times list, so I was very gratified to hear that. And
like Sunday?
Well, actually, it's going to be the 27th.
So a week from Sunday.
It's a week from Sunday, so I was very thrilled. And keep buying books.
Holiday, Florida, Republican line. Good morning.
Hi. I'd just like to make a few comments about how Al Gore shot himself in the foot. It starts out, and I'm just backing up Bill Simon here. Love Canal was such a farce that everybody knew about it. Him being the inventor of the internet, the Sarasota classroom lie that he told, on national television that he got caught with, the push polling that they did down here, lying about how the older people was going to have Social Security taken away from them, and the education issue with there'll be no longer school lunches, Head Start will be cut.
Okay, I'm going to leave it at that because we've been over these grounds so many times. I do want to come to our guests who have insight and background information and go back to what we were talking about earlier. Can you tell us anything about these two men? Somebody says to you, let's do it this way. You can interview George Bush, or you can interview Al Gore. What is your reaction with each one? What are you thinking right away when I say you're going to interview Al Gore?
You probably, from the beginning that Al Gore is going to want to talk about issues, and he's going to want to talk about nothing but issues.
Is there a give and take in the personality when you get there?
There's sometimes. It depends on his mood. He's not a stony or steely figure. He can be quite an affable figure. But let's talk about the reality of most of these interviews. I interviewed all the candidates, too. It's not like you sit down for 90 minutes with these guys and have a cup of coffee and a Coke and, you walk the property with them. Sometimes you get 20 minutes. Sometimes you get 40 if you're really, really lucky. They're giving you, sometimes you get 5 and 10. It's not real normal.
The president's leaving the White House right now. It looks like on his way somewhere. He's going to Lancaster County, Pennsylvania today. I wonder if he's just shaking hands or if the helicopter's there on the guy. It's raining here in town. Bill Salmon, what about Al Gore? Did you ever interview him?
Well, I've talked to him. I've never had a formal interview with him, but when you cover him for 18 months or 2 years, you end up having a number of conversations with him. Let me tell you one little anecdote that I found telling. Early in the campaign, we took a trip with Gore on Air Force Two, and it was an environmental photo op. He went down the Connecticut River. I write about this in the book. But the problem was he was taking a canoe trip. The river was so low that the advance teams thought that his canoe might get stuck. So what they did was they opened up a dam upriver and released 500 million gallons of water just before Gore got into his canoe, and it raised the level of the river. The only problem was it was a drought. People weren't allowed to water their lawns or wash their cars. And so to make this environmental photo op, they basically wasted 500 million gallons of water. Now, I broke the story, put it on the front page of the Washington Times the next day. I was there with the press. I found out about it, and everybody followed it. New York Times, Washington Post, CNN did follow-up stories on it, and they were furious. Gore was furious. Now, when Gore got out of the canoe and he was walking up to the podium to give some remarks, he was walking with an environmentalist who was part of this whole thing, and she was explaining about the dam being open, etc. And he said to her, oh, I understand about river fluctuations. I'm from Tennessee. We have the Tennessee Valley Authority. And so this was right after the canoe ride. When my story hit the next morning, I saw Gore at lunch. And I said, Mr. Vice President, how do you feel about the river having been raised on your behalf? And he looked at me with a straight face and he said, well, I didn't know it was until I read your paper this morning. Now, the woman that had set the whole thing up and was an ally of Gore had told me that she explained it to him yesterday. You know, so this sort of put him in a new light for me, and this told me a little bit something about his character.
As we continue our program, we've got 15 minutes left. The president taking off from the south lawn of the White House, as you can see on the screen, and we'll ask our guests about this person and what you think of him in just a moment as we take a call from Holland Patton, New York. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Yes. You asked earlier what difference it made what Europeans thought of us or what we thought of Europeans.
Yeah.
That's why we're off the Civil Rights Commission, I think, because we dictate to the Europeans, and the Europeans are now saying, get off, because, you know, we don't like your standards. And then we were horrified that they kicked us off.
So what about the question, though? Does it matter? I mean, does it matter you be on this, it's not civil rights, it's Human Rights Commission.
Human Rights Commission.
Yeah, I mean, but does any of this matter to us, really, in the long run?
Yes, I think it does.
And why?
Well, I think that if we wish to stay as a power in the country, in the world, that human rights do matter for everyone.
Thanks. As we watch this helicopter try to take off from the south lawn in the rain, but how about George Bush? What about Roger Simon? What about this man?
He's an affable, friendly person some of the time. The first time I interviewed him was on a bus in South Carolina, and he was in a snippy mood, and he was sitting across the bus aisle. His feet were on one set of seats, and he was on the other. And he was crumpling a Coke can in his hand, and he reached out a left hand and gave me a sort of a limp left-handed handshake. And it wasn't a very good interview. And I wrote a piece saying exactly what I just said to you. And the next time I saw him, he stood up and shook hands and was much friendlier.
I mean, do you think that they pay attention to that kind of thing?
They do. It's amazing. It is amazing how much time the White House spends, both the previous Clinton administration and this administration, studying the minutia of the press. They have more gossip about the press than we have about them.
Bill Salmon, what do you think?
Well, when I interviewed the president for this book, I had not covered him because I had always covered the Clinton administration and I covered the Gore campaign. So when I finished writing the book, and about a week after I got back on the job, I had a chance to sit down with him. And when I walked in to meet him, we both stood and greeted each other, and I'm 6'7". And I've said this before, but I said, there was a little awkward pause, and I said, well, what's this I hear about you calling somebody Stretch? Because he had given a nickname, he gives nicknames to everybody. Another reporter who was 6'5", the name is Stretch, he looked me up and down, he said, well, I guess we'll have to call you Super Stretch. So he's very disarming, he's very affable, and it's hard not to, and I thought the same thing about Clinton. It's hard not to find them likable on a personal level. They're both very likable guys.
One other thing, I saw him relaxed, really relaxed, only once on the whole campaign. I mean, that was on the record. And that's when he was going up and down the aisles of his plane, and he would get questions on this or that, and he would be a little guarded. And someone handed him a sports magazine that announced a big baseball trade. And he visibly, his shoulders loosened up, his whole body language was more open and friendly, and he talked for 15 minutes about baseball very knowledgeably. And I think that's what he really enjoys.
Kwaizi Mfume in just about 12 minutes. Fairfax, California on the Democratic line. Good morning.
Good morning. Since the first Miami Herald report came out trying to figure out how people voted under the circumstances that were prevailing at the time the Supreme Court made its decision, the Miami Herald and USA Today have been able to examine the overvotes as well, and on the basis of then the statewide recount of the overvotes as well as the undervotes, Al Gore came out ahead by 332 votes. In 3 out of 4 scenarios, the fourth one would just be a clean-cut punch with no hanging chads at all, and that's the only scenario under which Bush would have won. This has gotten absolutely no publicity. I just think it's really sad when the people's choice is not reflected in the outcome. And what is even more revealing is when they looked at the spoiled ballots that they couldn't retrieve a clear intent from. Statistically, 3 out of 4 of those spoiled ballots went for Democrat.
Okay, thanks. We're losing you with the transmission. And I want to go back to Roger Simon's book and some of the points you make, again, to get them on the record. When Simon asked, and this is your PR folks at the book, they did a good job here, by the way, all these good questions. Yeah, we don't have to do our work anymore. We just have to show up. when Simon asked a top Bush aide what Americans thought of when they thought about Bush's qualifications for president of the United States, the aide responded, adequacy.
They always had what they called the threshold theory.
That's a Bush aide, by the way. It says adequacy.
A Bush aide. He's talking about the intellectual weight, being able to deal with the minutiae of politics, of policy. They knew that George Bush would never match up against Al Gore on the ability to talk about legislation or the minutiae of a lot of public policy standards. They felt the public didn't want that. They felt that the public often distrusted men who seemed too intelligent and too much like wonks. They thought that his personality, Bush's personality and affability would be important if he could get over the threshold of people thinking, this guy knows enough, what they described as adequacy.
McDonough, Georgia on the Republican line. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, and just in response to that, George Bush is dumb like a fox. This man has brought back such trust in my mind to the White House versus the last 8 years. But what I really called in about was, what do you think the price of gasoline and the energy crisis would be facing if Al Gore was in the White House in terms of long-term decisions, since he certainly advocated environmental, was such a proponent of the environmental groups.
Bill Salmon?
Well, Al Gore was the guy that cast the tie-breaking vote in 1993 to raise the federal gasoline tax by, I believe, a nickel, bringing it to 18 cents, if I'm not mistaken. So, I mean, you know, he was for higher fuel taxes. There was talk of a BTU tax. I don't know where he would be today. I think he would be under pressure to reduce it and undo that damage.
In today's USA Today, Tracy Watson has a story that says the Bush White House says it is retaining, this is the lead story in the paper, is retaining strict air quality standards that were one of the most controversial legacies of the Clinton administration. The decision is arguably the best victory for environmentalists since President Bush took office. This is a leading question, but do you think if he had announced just the opposite, that Republicans would have automatically called up and said, he's right, and Democrats would have said he's wrong? But under these circumstances, you'd get both sides saying hurrah?
I'm not sure I'm tracking that.
Well, he basically accepted the Clinton recommendations, and as it says here, the decision is arguably the best victory for environmentalists. He decided to go with Bill Clinton had done. And do you think that on a given day, most Republicans react, no matter what he does, he's done the right thing?
Oh, sure. And I think this is another answer to your question on whether the White House polls or not. His approval ratings have been dropping in some part because of the arsenic issue and the reversal on CO2 standards. And the last caller talked about the price of gasoline. In his press conference, I think he gave probably the worst answer I've ever heard him give when he said, basically, it doesn't matter if gas goes to $3 a gallon as long as you get a tax cut. Most people don't believe that, I don't think. They don't care what the tax cut is they don't want to pay $3 a gallon for a gallon of gas, and they expect their president to do something about it.
Bill Salmon has the interview with President Bush in his book, and he says that there is such a goodness about America, that this is Mr. Bush speaking, President Bush, that that would enable me and others who are there for the right reasons in Washington, Republicans and Democrats, by the way, to prove the skeptics wrong, to seize upon the inherent spirit of America and move forward. And so So in kind of an interesting way, the House divided turned out to be an opportunity to unite. The country wants a different tone in Washington. I sense that, he added. The country doesn't want to go back to the days of divisiveness and bitterness. We go to Philadelphia. You're on the air.
Thank you for taking my call. The previous caller who talked about Love Canal, Newsweek magazine, I believe it was, carefully documented the fact that Al Gore, Mr. Gore, was totally misquoted on that, and yet the media played it up. And secondly, anyone who says that people in Florida who were denied the right to vote, when they appeared on television telling their stories of being denied the right to vote, and who now says on national television that there was none, to my way of thinking, has lost integrity and credibility. I'll listen.
Thank you, caller. Mr. Salmon.
Well, I think a lot of people were denied their right to vote in Florida, and the ones that I've seen the most documentation of are the military members, people serving overseas who cast ballots. One guy in particular, I found he had a very compelling case. His name was John Russell, Navy lieutenant. He was off the coast of Yemen rescuing the USS Cole, which had been hit by a terrorist bomb. 17 sailors had been killed. This guy volunteers to get into this dinky little Yemeni tugboat, which they were worried was booby-trapped, and push the USS Cole away from the fueling pier and out to safety. Meanwhile, 8,000 miles away in Jacksonville, in Jacksonville, they're throwing out, the Gore lawyers are throwing out his ballot and high-fiving each other. Why? Because it didn't have a postmark. The ostensible logic was, didn't have a postmark, maybe he mailed it the day after the election, but it was received the day before the election and time-stamped as such. So they were dinging him on a hyper-technicality and throwing out a perfectly good vote from a service member serving overseas. Here's a guy who wants to be commander-in-chief, willing to throw out these votes to get there.
John Feary of Dennis Hastert's office and Eric Alderman of The Nation are guests on Saturday morning. Robert Samuelson will be here on Monday. He's a Newsweek columnist. Tonight it's Elizabeth Cady Stanton from Seneca Falls, New York, our American Writers series. Monday's American Writers live program at 9 o'clock will be Nathaniel Hawthorne from Salem, Massachusetts, and Roger Simon, again from your book. People thought that Monica Lewinsky affair opened a rift between Clinton and Gore. In fact, it just widened a rift that was already there. Gore felt Clinton had used and betrayed him during the fundraising scandals of 1996. Quote, when I got into the campaign and found out that there has been this kind of an estrangement, I was really surprised. I really was. Bill Daley, Gore's campaign chairman, told you. Is that a surprise to you that they were that estranged, and do you believe it?
It was. We had been told for years that these two were the closest president and vice president in modern times, that they had lunch every week, nothing ever interrupted that lunch, and that they really were pals and got along. In fact, since the no prevailing legal authority press conference by Gore, in which he tried to explain how he made fundraising calls from the West Wing of the White House, there was a widening gulf between the two, because the president was smart enough not to make fundraising calls from the White House, but he never tipped off his vice president to that.
Two more calls, and then we have to, maybe just one more. We have to shut her down here because Kwesi Mfume is in the wings. Let's go to Columbia, South Carolina. Go ahead, please.
Yes, sir. I'd like to make a comment, and Brian, I'd like for you to do me the courtesy of letting me go on as long as you have some of the Democrats who have called. It never ceases to amaze me how the Democrats portray Bush as Machiavellian enough to steal the election, yet too ignorant to govern after the fact. When we all can see plainly that the real reason the election was lost by Gore, with the greatest economy at his back in the history of the world, was because it was a class-baiting, race-baiting, might be even Jew-baiting campaign. And then secondly, the general ineptness of the Democratic voter and the inability to understand how to operate the voting process. And this, too, could be attributed to the politicians who ill-served the Democrats in the educational process, as well as the other things that they look to their politicians for, is the reason Gore's people weren't able to vote to him. They weren't stopped from voting by anyone. They weren't prevented from voting. The simple fact of the matter was that when Jesse Jackson and people like him spent so much time registering people, they didn't spend any time teaching people what they were registering for and how to do what they were registering for. And that's just a simple fact of the matter.
The only thing I would say, I think he's referring obviously to the butterfly ballot in part. I find it hard to believe, and I've spent a lot of time reflecting on this, that tens of thousands of people went into one single county, voted accidentally for Buchanan, were cognizant that they made a mistake, but instead of turning in their ballot said, you know what, I've got to vote for Gore now, and then voted for Gore, thereby invalidating the ballots, still not turning these ballots back in, which they were entitled to and instructed to, putting them in the ballot box, walking outside, and then the terrible truth dawns upon them. Now, I could see a certain number of people doing that, maybe, but tens of thousands of people in a single county, I just don't buy it.
Roger Simon.
Why did they do it? Yeah. Why did they vote for just insanity?
I don't have an explanation. No, there's all kinds of theories that, you know, I'm not going to justify with, because I don't have evidence, but I don't buy that that's what happened. I don't know what the explanation is.
We've got just 30 seconds. Do you want the campaign of 2004 to be a rematch?
Do I want it to be?
Yeah. Would you like to go out there and see this thing go again?
I think it will be. And
Mr. Salmon, how about you? Would you like to see it again like this?
Well, yeah, I think it would be a very fun campaign to cover. It would have all the, you know, the hype of like a heavyweight rematch, like a boxing match. But again, I just don't see it happening. I don't see Gore getting barely even a speaking role at the Democratic National Convention.
We're out of time, and here are the two books, At Any Cost, How Al Gore Tried to Steal the Election by Bill Salmon, White House correspondent for the Washington Times, and the other book, Divided We Stand, How Al Gore Beat George Bush and Lost the Presidency by Roger Simon. Thank you, gentlemen, both for coming.
You can see Washington Journal live every day, beginning at 7 a.m. Eastern, 4 Pacific, here on C-SPAN. Wednesday, Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill will be on the program.